Here is what we know about census taking. You need trained enumerators. You need roads to move them. You need standardized forms, a literacy baseline among administrators, a chain of custody for collected data, and a central authority capable of processing thousands of individual records into a single coherent number. Build all of that correctly, and after several decades of institutional development, you can produce a reliable population count. That is the accepted explanation. It is taught in every history of statistics course. It is the framework used to date when modern demographic science begins. The problem is the data from Tartaria arrived earlier than the framework that was supposed to produce it. Not slightly earlier. Not by a margin that could be explained by a particularly efficient regional governor or an unusually well-organized frontier administration. We are talking about population figures from territories spanning millions of square kilometers, figures that appear in European records with a consistency, a geographic specificity, and an internal coherence that, when you examine the actual development timeline of statistical infrastructure in those regions, raises a question that is not easy to dismiss. How was this data collected before the systems that collect data existed? This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Tartary referred to in the cartographic and encyclopedic tradition of early modern Europe. From roughly the 1500s through the late 1700s, the region identified as Tartary, or Tartaria on maps, covered an enormous swath of Eurasia. It was not a tightly governed political unit in the way contemporary European states were. It was a geographic designation applied by European scholars, cartographers, and encyclopedists to a vast interior region that included much of what is now Central Asia, Siberia, Mongolia, and portions of northern China and Russia. European knowledge of this region was, by any honest assessment, fragmentary. Trade routes existed. Diplomatic missions passed through. Jesuit scholars produced reports. But comprehensive, systematic knowledge of population distribution across that interior, the kind of knowledge you would need to produce reliable demographic figures, was considered by contemporaries themselves to be difficult, contested, and incomplete. And yet, open the Encyclopaedia Britannica of 1771. Find the entry for Tartary. You will find population estimates. Specific ones. Ones that distinguish between regions. Chinese Tartary, independent Tartary, Russian Tartary, with a confidence that implies not speculation but compilation. The figures are presented not as rough guesses but as data points derived from some form of information gathering. That detail alone is not necessarily alarming. Encyclopedists of the era did make estimates. They extrapolated. They borrowed from travelers' accounts. That is understood. What is less easily explained is the consistency of those figures across independent sources. When historians of statistics trace the development of demographic infrastructure in Russia, the state that had the most sustained administrative presence in the northern and western portions of what was labeled Tartary, the picture is unambiguous. The Russian imperial census system, called the Revizia, began in 1718 under Peter the Great. It was imperfect, geographically limited, and took decades to extend meaningfully into Siberian territories. Historians of Russian administrative history note that reliable demographic reach into central Siberia was not achieved until well into the 19th century. This is documented. It is not a fringe position. It is the mainstream scholarly understanding of how Russian census infrastructure developed. So when European encyclopedists in the 1740s and 1750s published population figures for regions of Tartary that the Russian administrative apparatus had not yet formally enumerated, regions where no comparable census infrastructure existed in any documented form, the question that emerges is a methodological one, not a conspiratorial one. Where did those numbers come from? And more specifically, why do they cohere? That second question is the one that creates genuine analytical pressure. Invented numbers, estimates made up or heavily extrapolated without underlying data, tend to diverge when produced independently. Different sources working without shared data produce different figures. That is the statistical signature of estimation without evidence. But that is not consistently what you see with the Tartary demographic figures in this period. What you see across multiple European encyclopedic traditions, across French, British, and German geographic literature, is a set of figures that, while not identical, fall within ranges that suggest a shared informational origin, or a shared methodology, or something else that has not been fully accounted for. Set aside for a moment the question of what the origin was. Focus only on the pattern. The pattern is this: population data for one of the largest and least administratively developed regions on the planet appears in European scholarly literature with a regularity and internal consistency that outpaces the documented development of the infrastructure required to produce it. You can see a version of this problem in miniature if you look at individual city figures. Some urban centers within Tartary's geographic designation appear in European sources with population estimates that, when cross-referenced with archaeological and anthropological work on settlement density in those periods, raise calibration questions. The figures sometimes suggest densities that would have required agricultural, logistical, and supply systems of a scale that the historical record of those settlements does not straightforwardly support. This is not a claim. It is a calibration mismatch. And calibration mismatches, in rigorous historical methodology, are not supposed to be quietly absorbed. They are supposed to generate questions. What is curious is how rarely that particular question, the question of how the demographic data was produced, what institutional or observational mechanism generated it, and why it coheres across independent sources, appears in mainstream historiography of the period. The demographic figures are cited. They are used. They appear as background data in historical arguments about population trends, migration patterns, regional economic capacity. But the question of their origin, of the mechanism behind their production, tends to receive less systematic attention than you might expect given the scale of the infrastructural anomaly they represent. That absence is not an accusation. Historiography has priorities, and the question of how early modern encyclopedists produced their numbers for peripheral regions is genuinely a specialist interest, not a central one. But when you sit with the numbers long enough, when you map the documented timeline of administrative infrastructure against the documented timeline of demographic claims, something in the alignment does not quite settle. The data existed before the systems that were supposed to produce data had been built in that region. And that is only the beginning of the pattern. Before we move outward, it is worth pausing on what the Tartary demographic situation actually establishes as a template. The issue is not that data was wrong. The issue is that data was structured, internally coherent, geographically differentiated, categorically organized, at a moment when the apparatus for structuring data in that region was, by the historical record of administrative development, not yet present in its mature form. The data looks like the output of a system. The system, as documented, was not yet fully operational. That is a specific kind of anomaly. And once you recognize its shape, you begin to notice it in other places. Not as a Tartary-specific peculiarity, as a pattern. Take the United States in the early 19th century. The American constitutional census begins in 1790. That is well documented, well understood, and relatively uncontroversial as a starting point for formal American demographic infrastructure. What is more interesting is what happens in the decades immediately following, not with the census itself, but with the ancillary data systems that begin appearing alongside it. By the 1820s and 1830s, American cities are generating municipal statistical reports, mortality tables, birth registers, occupational breakdowns, at a level of categorical sophistication that, when measured against the actual size of the municipal bureaucracies producing them, requires some explanation. These were not large administrative bodies. They did not have professional statistical offices in any modern sense. The concept of a professional statistician as a distinct occupational category barely existed yet in the United States. And yet the reports are detailed. They are systematized. They use consistent categorical frameworks across cities that had no formal mechanism for coordinating their methodology. Historians of American statistical development, scholars like Patricia Klein Cohen, whose work on numeracy in early America is foundational, have noted that the appetite for quantification in this period ran ahead of the formal infrastructure that would, in any conventional developmental model, be expected to precede it. That is the same structural shape as the Tartary problem. Not identical in cause or context, but identical in form. The data arrives before the system that produces data is fully built. The pressure increases when you look at infrastructure in a more literal sense. In the 1830s and 1840s, American canal and early railroad networks were being planned using projected population and trade flow figures for regions that were, at the time of planning, sparsely settled frontier. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, was projected based on demographic and commercial estimates for territories that had not yet been formally surveyed or settled at the densities the projections assumed. The standard explanation is entrepreneurial optimism. Investors and planners building ahead of demand, speculating on growth, sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. That explanation is reasonable. It is probably largely accurate. But it creates an interesting infrastructural record. Systems scaled for populations that did not yet exist, in territories whose demographic trajectories were being confidently projected by institutions that had no direct observational access to the variables they were projecting. When those projections turned out to be broadly correct, when the populations arrived, when the trade flows materialized, the standard reading is good planning, visionary investment. What the standard reading does not dwell on is the epistemic question. How were the projections calibrated? What was the observational basis for the demographic assumptions baked into infrastructure decisions of that scale and cost? Move to Britain, and the pattern takes a different but structurally adjacent form. The British statistical movement, the formation of statistical societies in Manchester and London in the early 1830s, the establishment of the General Register Office in 1836, the development of civil registration for births, deaths, and marriages, is often presented as a response to the chaos of industrialization. Rapid urbanization created public health crises, and the statistical apparatus was built to manage them. That narrative is accurate in its broad strokes. What it compresses is the lead time problem. The General Register Office, from essentially its first years of operation under William Farr, was producing analytical demographic work, age-specific mortality rates, occupational health breakdowns, geographic disease mapping, of a sophistication that required not just data collection, but a pre-existing conceptual architecture for what questions to ask of the data, what categories to use, what comparisons to make. Conceptual architecture of that kind does not emerge from nothing in the first years of an institution's operation. It is built over time through iterative failure and refinement. It requires a prior tradition of quantitative thinking applied to human populations. The historiography of British statistics acknowledges this, pointing to earlier traditions of political arithmetic. William Petty in the 17th century, John Grunt's work on London bills of mortality. Those are real precedents. But when you trace the actual methodological lineage, when you ask how the sophisticated demographic framework that Farr's office was using in the late 1830s connects to the earlier political arithmetic tradition, the transmission is not always clean. There are gaps in institutional continuity. There are moments where capacity appears to jump rather than develop incrementally. None of these examples, American Canal projections, British registration sophistication, Tartary encyclopedic coherence, proves any single thing on its own. But the accumulation invites a methodological question that is different from the individual cases. If this were one region, one period, one anomalous archive, the explanation would be straightforward. Local conditions, exceptional individuals, particular circumstances. That is how historical anomalies are usually resolved, and usually correctly. But the pattern recurs across regions with no direct administrative connection to each other. It recurs across different institutional contexts: encyclopedic, governmental, commercial. It recurs across a time window that is specific enough to be notable, roughly the late 18th century through the first half of the 19th. Systematically, across this period, demographic and statistical infrastructure appears to operate ahead of the development timeline that the standard institutional history of each region would predict. The data coheres before the machinery of coherence is fully in place. In recent years, some researchers examining these overlapping anomalies across Eurasian, American, and British historical records have begun grouping them under a broader interpretive frame, one that asks whether these patterns, taken together, suggest something about the prior state of the world that the conventional developmental timeline does not fully account for. That framing has acquired a label. It is not a label that mainstream historiography uses. It is not a label that comes with institutional endorsement, but it is a label that has begun to organize a particular set of questions. Questions about coherence, timing, and the relationship between data and the systems supposed to produce it. That label, and what it actually does and does not claim, is where this examination has to go next. The word Tartaria appears on maps for nearly 3 centuries without generating significant controversy. It is there in Ortelius. It is there in Mercator. It is in the great French cartographic tradition of the 17th century, in the German geographic encyclopedias of the 18th, in the Britannica entry we visited earlier. For the scholars and cartographers who used it, Tartaria was simply a geographic designation, a label applied to a vast interior region that European knowledge had not yet fully resolved into the nationally bounded territories that would eventually replace it on later maps. By the early 19th century, the label had largely disappeared from formal geographic and administrative usage. The territories it once designated had been absorbed into the expanding administrative frameworks of the Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty, and the Central Asian states that European and colonial cartography was, by then, mapping with increasing specificity. The word went quiet for roughly a century and a half. Then it returned. And when it returned, it was carrying something considerably heavier than a geographic designation. In online research communities, beginning roughly in the 2010s and accelerating significantly through the early 2020s, the term Tartaria began appearing in a very different context. Not as a cartographic label, not as a historian's shorthand for a geographic region, but as an interpretive framework, a loose, heterogeneous, and internally contested set of claims organized around the proposition that something significant about the pre-19th century world has been inadequately explained by conventional historical accounts. It is important to be precise about what this means and what it does not mean. The Tartaria framework, as it circulates in these communities, is not a single unified theory. It does not have a founding text, an institutional body, or a consensus position. It is better understood as a cluster of questions, some more responsibly framed than others, that share a common structural concern, that the physical, demographic, and infrastructural record of certain periods and regions contains patterns that the standard developmental timeline of human civilization does not straightforwardly account for. Some of these questions are the ones this documentary has been examining. The coherence of demographic data before the administrative infrastructure to produce it. The appearance of complex systems before the demand those systems were built to serve. The calibration mismatches between what the record shows and what the institutional history of record-keeping would predict. Others extend well beyond those questions into territory that is considerably more speculative, and considerably less grounded in the kind of archival and methodological analysis that the demographic anomalies represent. That distinction matters, because the responsible analytical question, why does demographic data from certain regions appear structured before the infrastructure for structuring it was demonstrably present, is a question that historians of statistics, historical demographers, and scholars of administrative history do engage with, even when they do not frame it in the language of the Tartaria discussion. The answers they offer are varied and worth taking seriously. One interpretation centers on what scholars call retrospective compilation, the possibility that figures which appear in encyclopedic sources as contemporary estimates were actually compiled from older, incomplete, and heterogeneous sources of uncertain date, then presented as current without adequate acknowledgement of their patchwork origins. On this reading, the coherence of the figures is partly an artifact of the encyclopedic tradition itself, which imposed categorical order on data that was, in its raw form, far messier than the published product suggested. This is a credible explanation. It accounts for some of the pattern. A second interpretation focuses on parallel development, The argument that demographic intuitions and counting practices existed in pre-institutional forms that the formal administrative history of census taking tends to overlook. Nomadic confederacies, trading networks, religious institutions, and tributary systems all had functional reasons to maintain population estimates, and some researchers argue that European encyclopedists were drawing on these informal information networks in ways that the published record does not make explicit. The infrastructure, on this reading, existed. It simply was not the kind of infrastructure that shows up in histories of state bureaucracy. This too is a credible explanation. It accounts for a different portion of the pattern. A third interpretation, less developed in the academic literature, more prominent in the Tartaria adjacent online discourse, proposes that the demographic coherence and infrastructural lead time anomalies reflect not inadequate documentation of informal systems, but the remnants of a prior organizational capacity that the conventional historical timeline has not fully integrated. Not a hidden empire, not an erased civilization, but perhaps a level of connectivity, information sharing, or administrative sophistication in certain periods and regions that has been underweight in the standard account of how the modern world developed from its pre-modern antecedents. This interpretation is harder to evaluate. It is harder to evaluate because it is, by its nature, gestural. It points toward an explanatory gap without being able to fully specify what would fill it. And that is precisely the quality that makes it generative in some research communities and frustrating in others. What the Tartaria label has done, whatever its limitations and whatever its less responsible applications, is aggregate a set of questions that were previously scattered across specialist literatures with no common framing. The historian of Russian administrative development asking about census infrastructure in Siberia was not, previously, in conversation with the historian of American statistical development asking about the epistemic basis of canal projections. The scholar examining British registration sophistication was not comparing notes with the analyst examining demographic figure coherence in 18th-century European encyclopedias. The Tartaria framework, chaotic and uneven as it is, has created a space where those questions are being asked in proximity to each other. Whether that proximity produces insight or noise depends entirely on the rigor with which the questions are pursued. Some of what circulates under that label deserves serious methodological skepticism. Some of it represents the kind of pattern recognition that, if it were applied more rigorously and subjected to genuine archival scrutiny, might produce questions worth asking in more formal contexts. The difficulty is that the label itself has become sufficiently associated with its least careful applications that the more grounded questions it touches, questions about timing, coherence, and the relationship between data and the infrastructure of data production, tend to be dismissed along with the speculation. That is not how anomalies are supposed to be resolved. An anomaly that has not been fully explained by the existing interpretive framework is not resolved by the disrepute of those who noticed it. It is resolved by the work of accounting for it. The demographic figures from the territories once labeled Tartaria remain in the archive. They remain coherent across independent sources. They remain ahead of the documented development timeline of the administrative infrastructure that the conventional account requires to produce them. The competing explanations, retrospective compilation and formal network data, underweight prior capacity, each account for part of the pattern. None of them, examined carefully, accounts for all of it. And the part that remains unaccounted for does not resolve into a conclusion. It sits in the record, structured and consistent, waiting for a framework rigorous enough to hold it. What that framework looks like, and whether the existing historiography is positioned to build it, is a question this examination cannot answer. Only note that the question is still open.